When was Deuteronomy written? And why was it written? Yeah, right before the Israelites went into the promised land. How do we recognize our present dilemma, and how does it relate to the Israelites going into the promised land? Scott kind of touched upon it. Okay. Thank you. So basically, as they were entering into the promised land with Moses, well, without Moses, actually, we are entering into the promised land with Jesus Christ. So as we're studying the lesson, we need to be thinking in terms of that. So we understand why this lesson, this quarter, is called Present Truth in Deuteronomy. And we also are going to be talking about the connection about then and now. Now, our lesson today is simply the preamble to Deuteronomy. What is a preamble? When you think of preamble, go ahead, Keith. Okay. Okay, when you think of preamble, what do you think of? Okay. Okay. Kind of like an introduction. Okay. When I think of preamble, I think of the Constitution of the United States. It's an opening statement, kind of, okay? And I thought this was interesting, and I'm not going to get into politics, but I'm going to read this today, because the preamble, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. And as I read this, kind of think about their Christian thought back then and our walk with Jesus going into heaven. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. How do you think we're doing? I thought it was interesting, because just as we see what's happening out there, we can take a look at us to see how we're doing. And I do believe that this quarter, this lesson, is touching upon that aspect. How are we doing? And the lesson, and we're not going to go in order of this, but it touches upon God's love, the fall and the flood. And we've talked a lot about the fall and the flood last time, so I'm not talking about it as much today. Call of Abraham, the covenant of Sinai, and apostasy and punishment are basically a lot of what's happening. So, introduction to Deuteronomy, we actually answered this. Who is the undisputed author of this book? Moses. What is the meaning of the name of this book? Anyone know? Yeah, it actually takes its name. Very good. It actually takes its name from a Greek word, deuteronomion, and I'm probably not saying that correctly, so. And it means second law or repeated law. So Moses is actually doing what? He's repeating what they should already know. Okay, now this is before they're going into the promised land. For whom were the words of this book intended? Us. Amen. But originally they were intended for the Israelites. But the application is for us today. Just like that journey, we see parallels between those two journeys. Okay, what message do you think Moses wanted to get across to the people? And it's not just one. What was the message he wanted to get across? God is God, obey him. Okay. Blessings and curses. Yes. He said blessings and curses. Yep. Okay. And that's a good point to think of as we talk about something else. Okay. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind. It really is. Which is why, in a way, this quarter, it's a summation of the year of what we've been studying. When you think about it, how they have led up to this quarter. Okay. What book was this in the Pentateuch? It was the last one, number 5. It was the summation of everything. What are some other things that he was wanting to convey here? God is love. And we have a choice. Okay. And we're going to talk about that. How about the don't forget? Don't forget what God has done for you and how he delivered you from bondage. That's huge. Yeah, remember the laws. Remember the obedience and blessings and disobedience that they brought the curses like Scott had mentioned. So as we're doing this, we too need to remember we can't forget what God has done for us. Go ahead. Thank you. Oh, I thought you had something. What I want to do is read this. It says, to stress the importance of the covenant, Moses repeated to the people the 10 Commandments, the legal foundation of their obligations in the covenant that the Lord had first cut with their fathers and again was doing so, but now with them right on the borders of Canaan. Huge. This is from the lesson. It says, might there be parallels with what the children of Israel on the borders of the promised land face and what today, right on the border of the promised land, we face as well? It really is the same. So, if it is so similar, then what we need to do is we need to study the Israelites right before they went into the promised land to see what we're doing like them that needs to be done differently, etc. Nice and loud so they can hear you. That's the preamble. Okay, and then Scott actually answered this question. What do you think correlates to this Deuteronomy of today? What do you think correlates to this in Deuteronomy that we have today that we're using? Yes, the 3 angels' message. God gave to the children of Israel, through Moses, the book of Deuteronomy, a second law, a second chance, a remember this before you go into the promised land. We have the 3 angels' message today that we need to keep forever in our thoughts and in our hearts as we are going into the promised land out of slavery. Because I don't care what you say, sin enslaves us. We are in slavery. Amen. Have any of you, and that makes me think, and this isn't a question, but have any of you ever tried to look at other churches to see which one is closer than this church to the Bible? Because, Why? What would be your purpose for that? And I'm not asking as a derogatory thing, I'm asking as a positive thing. Did not know that. I didn't realize that, but even as a Seventh-day Adventist, you always want to find what truth is. I am a Christian. I'm a Seventh-day Adventist because it's the church closest to, I believe, what the Bible says. Yes, Ken. Yeah, Great Controversy does a great explanation of how that happens. I'm not going to go into the outline of Deuteronomy much. I just want you to know that it starts with Moses' first speech. He does have a second and a third speech, and then, of course, the end of Moses' life. And we'll be touching upon the book of Deuteronomy. Now, I would like to read this to you. This is by an atheist called David Hume. Is he willing to, and this is basically what most people frequently use as an argument against Christianity and the existence of evil in the world. And he says, is he willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil? You probably have heard this before. How could God allow this? Why would God allow this? God's get blamed on everything. Now, my question to you is, how would you answer this as a Christian? Okay. 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 It is coming. Scott? Okay. 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 Great point. But it goes even further than that, because what did Moses experience at the end of? He dies, and in the book of Jude, we see that he rose. And Satan goes, no, you can't have him, he's mine. Jesus says, get away from me, Satan. And so with all of that, we see the promise of what Jesus has done for heaven. Yes? Okay. Next question. Is evil part of God's plan, or is it an intrusion on his perfect creation? And I guess your answer will depend on your view of God and the extent of his foreknowledge of future events. And we're going to look into that, yes. Well, we'll get confused today. I probably could guarantee that with some of the questions. Go ahead. Nice and loud so we can hear you. Okay. Yeah. Well, but the question was, is evil part of God's plan, or is it an intrusion on his perfect creation? And we don't have to answer that now. Maybe we could come back to it. Let's go on because, you know, yes. Huh? Okay. Okay. God planned for the what? And I think this next quote is basically what you're saying. And let me read it. It says, in brief, and I love this. It says, in brief, I argue that God's love, properly understood, is at the center of a cosmic dispute, and that God's commitment to love provides a morally sufficient reason for God's allowance of evil. I'll repeat that again. God's commitment to love. He's committed to love. Isn't that amazing? His commitment to love provides a morally sufficient reason for God's allowance of evil, with significant ramification for understanding divine providence as operating within what I call covenantal rules of engagement. This is by John C. Peckham, Theodicy of Love, Conflict, and so forth. So, the question of free will and love. What must love to be love be? Why must love to be love be freely given? Okay, if it's anything else, it's forced. Huh? Or earned. Okay, good. I like that. So, given all the suffering in the world, some would argue that love was not worth it. How would you answer that challenge? What is life without love? 1 John 4:8, but anyone who does not love does not know God, for God is love. So we see God is love. So, I think we've been talking about it. What does God is love mean to you? And I think you've answered some of that. How do you understand God's law with this in mind? As we look at the Ten Commandments, how do you understand God's love with his law in mind? Yes. So do you give guidelines to your children so that they will be safe? So, okay, go ahead. Amen. You know, later on I have the question, would you not, knowing your statistics of what can go wrong, would you not have children because of that? No. Why would God not? You know? Yeah. Oh, don't use that word vaccination. I mean, that just is going to cause. Boy, we've gotten the Constitution today. We've talked about vaccination. I'm going to get kicked out of the church. No. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I agree. And that's basically what my thought process is too. The 10 commandments are God's loving way to get through this life with the least amount of damage as possible when you think about it. And when we break those commandments, what happens? We get hurt. Or it hurts others. And I'm sure all of us have done both, you know, and we don't deserve to go into the promised land. But like Moses, we have Jesus that says, get away from me, Satan. You know, I've covered it. Go ahead, Michelle. Were you going to say more? Yes. Oh, this one? Let's see, where is it? I can't see. I think it's this one. There it is. There it is. When I read this, I'm like, wow, God's commitment to love. Because what is love? Love is patient. Love is kind. It's not envious. It's not proud. It doesn't boast. It doesn't, all of those in there. Doesn't want its own way. God is love. Mm-hmm. God is love. It is. And with that in mind, what if I said, God is hate? Well, we know he can't be. But how do you relate to this earth in terms of the opposite of what God is and see what is happening? How much hope would you have with God is hate? I mean, that's a terrible thought when you think of it. But think of it in terms of what God is doing with God is love. You see where I'm going with that? Go ahead. Yeah, and basically a point is, how do you understand all of this, that God is love, by using the antonym of God is hate? It just gives you a little wow on who God is and what he's done. So we've talked about, we've talked about 1 Corinthians 13, about who God is. As a matter of fact, 1 Corinthians 13 is used a lot about what love is to one another, etc. But really, it's talking about God. It says God is love, and then 1 Corinthians 13 is the love chapter, and it says love is patient, love is kind. Love, yeah, and so it goes all into the characteristics of who God is. It's beautiful when you think of it. Okay, okay. Let's go to Genesis 6, 5, and 6. Who would like to read this? Can you see it? Mark, go ahead. Ah, it broke his heart. That sentence tells us a lot about God and who he is. What does it tell you about God and the extent of his foreknowledge of future events? Because we have this picture of God, all knowing, all powerful. What does "it broke his heart" talk to you about his foreknowledge of future events? And are there events that he does not have foreknowledge of? Are there events that he does? Mm-hmm. I have that immaturity way about me. Glennis is still saying that. You know, I say that because I've spent some time with them, and I've heard some of their stories. And as a pastor, some of his stories of what they all went through were hysterical, just hysterical. I mean, what a family. Can I just share one of them? Do you mind? Would you mind? Here he is as a pastor, and he's, race car driving. His mark here is in the family. And so he was speeding, and a police car started chasing him. So Glennis is in the front seat, the two kids in the back. And so he pulls into somebody's driveway, turns the lights off, and tells everybody to duck so that the police car could just go by him. This was in Wyoming, though, so things were different. But some of these stories were hysterical. Look who's here. How are you doing? Good to see you. So, getting back to the extent of foreknowledge of future events, are there events that he does have foreknowledge of? Are there events that he does not have foreknowledge of? Say that again? Okay. Anyone else? Yes, Bill. Okay. Okay. Did somebody else have a hand up over here? Okay. What? We talk about Genesis 2:16 about them eating from the garden. The lesson went into that. We've studied that and so forth. Before before the Israelites went into the promised land, what were they doing? Why were they not allowed to go into the promised land? There are a couple of reasons, but one thing they were doing was, They were complaining. They were complaining. Somebody talking back there? Yes. Okay, they were basically, though, they were complaining about God had shown them all of these things, what he'd done. He'd taken them through the Red Sea, out of Egypt, and all this stuff. Now he's telling them to go into this land. And there were 10 of the spies that gave a very bad report. The people complained. They doubted. They doubted God. They complained about, yeah. Okay. The lesson actually mentions this. At the very bottom of the lesson, it says, take a mental note of your thoughts throughout the day. What does this teach you about the state of your own heart? I just thought that was, something that take a mental note, because, when it talked about this in Genesis and so forth, there's not enough time to teach everything that you would like to during this time. So you have to go through, you study, you get some things, and then you have to kind of narrow it down. But one thing I found this week is how long of time do you think went between the flood and the building of the Tower of Babel? How many years do you think? Okay. Michelle, would you do me a favor and go turn my phone off? That's me. I'm so sorry. Thank you, Lana. Thank you. It was about 300 years because from the generations of all of that they'd studied, it was about 300 years. That's more time than when the Constitution was signed that we talked about at the beginning of our lesson to now. It was more time. And so in that amount of time, sin had gotten so bad that God, and that's a miracle in itself how he dispersed it, because who was the one that actually started Babylon? Do you remember who the person was that started Babel? Nimrod. And who was Nimrod's father? Nimrod's father was, Cush. Okay, and Cush's father was, can't eat this stuff, Ham. It's amazing how that is. That's how I remember it, very unkosher. He was the bad one of the bunch kind of thing. And then, of course, Ham's father was Noah. So you had basically 4 generations from all of this with Nimrod. And I was thinking about this here. What a miracle that here we're talking. Can you imagine God not wanting, he wants this to happen. I'm using this as an example. Not wanting us to be together. So every one of us can't understand each other. All of a sudden I'm speaking a different language. What that would have to do to my mind to get that in there. And that happened that day at the Tower of Babel. Just food for thought on how that happened, because things had gotten so bad. So what does Nimrod do? The languages, everybody's dispersed. And I read, and I don't know how true this is, but they said the Tower of Babel was about 2 miles high. 2 miles high. And that there were apartments on the base of this thing. It was so huge. But where did Nimrod go next? Then when they got dispersed? I'm sorry, I can't hear. Well, he was at Babel, and now God has dispersed the languages. So from Babel, he goes over to build another city. Nineveh. Yeah, he goes over and builds Nineveh. So that you see now you have the Assyrians starting, you have the Babylonians starting. And if Daniel wrote the book in Daniel chapter 2 earlier, if he was around, the first one would have been Assyria because that was a big nation. And as you're reading the Bible, think of those things because Assyria had a big part in dispersing the 10 tribes, northern tribes. Now, I'd like to get into freedom of choice. How can sin arise in a perfect being in a perfect place? And some of these, food for thought, but if we have a free will argument saying that God, the reason God chose to create beings with a free will was that he wanted to have a love relationship with us. And love cannot be forced. It can't be programmed. Okay. 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 Well, mhm. So when God created human beings with freedom of choice, there was a possibility for not choosing him. Okay, and we call that the mystery of iniquity, which was one of the headings. Okay. Okay. But did God think that there would be a possibility of it? So, in essence, you're answering the question earlier that it wasn't something that was going to happen. It was more of a, what was the word I used? Oh, but go ahead. Yeah. It was an intrusion on his plan of salvation. Okay. 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 So, getting back to freedom to choose, is God responsible for a creation where evil would definitely exist or where only the possibility of evil would exist? And I think you answered that. The possibility? Okay. Is God unable or unwilling or both to prevent evil? Okay. Uh huh. Okay. That's a hard word, malevolent. The commitment to love. Okay. Yes, Keith. As soon as the movement started coming with Ellen White and creation and the three angels message. Yeah, and and I do want to say this. As we study this, as we have our intellect that God has given us being able to digest all of this in our heads, I do want to say that we are human beings, that we do not fully understand God. We don't understand totally all He has done for us. And I believe that when we get to heaven and we meet God face to face and we ask Him questions, I wonder how our perspective is going to change on some of the things that we feel we understand. And I'm not saying we don't understand things correctly. What I am saying is that I think we might be a little bit surprised. Did you have your hand up, Bill? Okay. Oh, you did. Go ahead, Ken. Because, hand up. Nice and loud. Yeah, and I actually agree with you, Mark. Yeah. I would love to continue this because really we have two different thought processes going on with that comment. And there's no time. There's no time to continue it, but I actually cut that verse out because there was so much, and we've talked about the iniquity of sin and things like that in last lessons. But thank you for sharing that because gives a different trajectory of where we could go with this conversation. You can almost have two sides to see. I lean on your side actually from what I have studied, but I agree with other things. Let's move on to the covenants. Just touching upon them, what does the Apostle Paul point out about the covenant with Abraham? Could somebody please read this for me? Galatians 3:18 to 20. Yeah. Who was the mediator at Mount Sinai? Moses was. So we know that at Sinai, Moses was the mediator. He was the go-between between God and the people. So what implication here is that God doesn't need a mediator with Abraham? What is the implication? Moses was the mediator between God and the people, but here there's no mediator with Abraham. What does that mean? What does that signify? What does it tell you is happening here? Abraham spoke directly to God, okay. But so did some of the people of Moses. The elders went up to the mountain, spoke with God, but still there was a mediator. What does this tell you? Why does God not need a mediator here? Is it two-sided? Okay. Okay. Well, I guess what I'm trying to get, and you're correct, and maybe I'm not asking it right, but it's basically a one-sided covenant here. The covenant with Abraham was simply God's promise to him. Go ahead. Okay, go ahead. Okay, yes. Yes. And I was going to get to that. You're right. Yeah. But basically God gave something to Abraham. All he did need was to believe it. Faith. Okay? Yes, it is important. Go ahead. Okay? And just like that, as Abraham, it says it was God's promise to do certain things for Abraham without requiring Abraham to do anything other than to believe his word. In this sense, what you're saying, the Abrahamic covenant was a type or a shadow of the everlasting covenant that became manifest in the new covenant ratified by Jesus on the cross. Go ahead. And it's a new covenant, but at the same time, you can think of it as the same covenant. The only reason why it's different is because one is looking forward, the other is looking past, and we've talked about that before. And that's where it's one-sided, because without that, God is doing everything for us. It's like a gift that we just take and receive it. Okay, what were some of the promises that God made to Abraham? And as you're answering these, think about the promises he made for us going into heaven. What were some of the promises he said? All people of the earth will be blessed. He's going to have a mighty nation. We're going to be a mighty nation when we go to heaven. All the universe is going to be blessed by us, believe it or not. Isn't that amazing? What else? He promised that his seed would come through Abraham, seed being Jesus Christ, blessing, protection, and so forth. Now, what I'd like to do is go on, is in the covenant at Sinai, what did God offer to do for Abraham's descendants? Go ahead and somebody please read that. You know, when I studied the covenants and then read in Peter how we're going to be a holy nation, a kingdom of priests, etc., and I'm paraphrasing, it showed you how Peter understood the covenants, especially this one. So, what are the covenant promises here? Children of Israel are going to be a special treasure to God. Out of all the people of the earth, they will be his treasured possession. There will be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, etc. Let's move on. Any comments about this? Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. The mediator. Chris, beautiful. Beautiful. Which means every door for Jesus. You know, we have got to get out there to tell the people what Jesus has done for us. And I'm at the point where let them just believe in Jesus and let God take care of their relationship and their growth from there. Our job is to get it out and to hopefully they would want to come to us for the knowledge of it, like so many of us are here because of that. You know, you didn't grow up a Seventh-day Adventist, Chris, did you? Mark didn't, I didn't, you didn't. So a lot of us God has brought out of the world to where we are today. And Exodus 19:7-8 says, "So Moses came and called the elders of the people and laid before them all these words which the Lord commanded him. Then all the people answered together and said, 'All that the Lord has spoken we will do.' So Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord." Now, did they know what they were saying they were going to follow at this point? No, they didn't. They just said they were going to do it. And we see that they didn't. So did they keep their promise? It was impossible. What do you think could have helped them do a better job of obedience? Okay. Anyone else have a different thought? And I don't disagree with that. Yeah. Well, I've got to stop, but I just want to say true obedience is motivated by love. And we have talked about that. And John 14:15 says, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." And I've always thought of this as being an outsider, going door to door, knocking on the door. You love Jesus, you're going to keep his commandments kind of thing. It was this week that I saw an opposite side of this, and I don't know if I can explain it, but because when my love grows for Jesus, I'll be better able to keep his commandments. So it was more like, you know, if you love me, you're going to keep my commandments kind of thing. But it's not that at all. It's the closer I get to Jesus, the more I love him, the more I personally want to keep his commandments. Do you see the different train of thought there? Yes, Michelle first. Yes, yes. let me just close with this since we have to close. The decree that Israel was not to enter Canaan for 40 years was a bitter disappointment to Moses and Aaron, Caleb, and Joshua. Yet without a murmur, they accepted the divine decision. But those who had been complaining of God's dealings with them and declaring that they would return to Egypt wept and mourned greatly when the blessings which they had despised were taken from them. They had complained at nothing, and now God gave them cause to weep. Had they mourned for their sin when it was faithfully laid before them, this sentence would not have been pronounced. But they mourned for the judgment. Their sorrow was not repentance and could not secure a reversing of their sentence. We don't have time to answer this today, but how will this be similar in the end days? Why I mentioned earlier that the lesson brought out, check your thoughts as you go throughout the day. Do you have a complaining spirit? You know, it's food for thought, I know for me personally, especially when things happen. You know, we can complain about it. But when we look back and see something bad that's happened has really been a blessing for us, it's a different story. Let's bow our heads as we close. Father in heaven, we thank you for the Sabbath. We thank you for the Bible that we can go back and read in Deuteronomy about the chosen people going into the promised land. And Lord, today, your chosen people are ready to go into the promised land. Guide us this quarter as we study this to see what they did right, what they did wrong, that we can learn from their mistakes. But most importantly, Lord, guide our love for you, guide our relationship with you, guide us to love you so much that we can't think of not keeping the commandments. And I pray, Lord, that you will be with each and every one of us. Guide us to be mediators, as Chris mentioned, between you and the people that don't know you.